in 314 for a shooting at Century Theaters. They're saying somebody's shooting in the auditorium.
Roger, keep your fires west of the smoke. You're cleared hot. An officer hit. Send me the world.
Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again.
Welcome to Tactical Tangents.
Welcome back to Tactical Tangents. This is Mike. This episode is brought to you by DVIDS Outdoor, your go-to source for lightweight, portable, and versatile lighting solutions built for the outdoors and beyond. Whether you need scene lighting for public safety emergencies or reliable area lighting for your campsite, DVIDS has you covered. Their LED lanterns offer variable outputs and color options with Bluetooth remote controls that provide a complete ecosystem of lighting in a compact and easy-to-deploy package. These lights are perfect for camping, hunting, search and rescue, crime scene processing, and nighttime operations. DVIDS optimizes your experience and alleviates your pain points with extra power banks, solar panels, and more. DVIDS Outdoor ensures that you have long-lasting portable lighting no matter where you are. Check out their lineup at DVIDS Outdoor.com or find them on Amazon. Again, that's DVIDS Outdoor.com. This episode was also brought to you by Lowa Boots. Start your day off on the right foot with footwear that was designed for those who stand relentlessly in the face of adversity. I wear Lowa every single day, for miles on canine searches and for hours on tactical operations in inclement weather. No matter what, Lowa keeps me moving. Whether you run, hike, hunt, or fight, on the streets or out in the woods, Lowa has the gear you need to help you conquer whatever challenges you face. Go check out their new line of trail running shoes at Lowa Boots, L-O-W-A Boots.com, and get outside for some fresh air and daylight. Lowa, for those who know where they're going and won't stop until they get there.
So about a year ago, I visited a high school out in Southern California, which is several layers of cultural experience, right? I know California being what it is.
Also home, to be fair.
Yeah. And I had a series of kind of eye-opening conversations. It was a funny day. They just had some drama the day before at that school. And so everyone was in kind of a funny mood. And I was trying to kind of lighten up the mood and get people talking. And I said, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I asked maybe 20 different high school kids that. And these were typically kind of the more academically oriented kids, honors AP types. And I was really surprised that not one mentioned like a traditional profession, doctor, lawyer, pilot, cop, anything like that. Almost to a person, they either said IT, they want to go into in my mind, IT is like the people who fix the printers, right? Like maybe they meant higher end IT, I don't know, or influencer. Literally Instagram, TikTok influencer. And that was it. Every one of them. Cool. So it was a little bit of I'm like, whoa, kids these days. And, good on them. More power to them, right? They're adapting to this technological environment that I didn't grow up in. And a lot of those traditional professions and are going to be challenged by tech, right? When you think about how many pilots are we going to need going into the future? How many even doctors are we going to need going to the future? There's a lot of that is going to be augmented or supplanted by AI or whatever takes over AI, right? And it was just one of those really hit me in the face, ooh, we're getting old. And so us Gen Xers and us millennials, and I'll explain kind of where the cut lines are. We are literally getting old. And we're now in the senior leadership of our agencies, or not, but we're at least aged that way. And Gen Zers are now making up the bulk of the military and the police force. And pretty shockingly soon after that, it's going to be the Gen Alphas who are the bulk of the military, police force, all the communities. So just to keep things straight, when we talk about generations, we are intentionally generalizing. That's kind of the point, right? And there are a lot of exceptions. There are old people who are super techie. There are young people who are like, no, I just like to, chop wood with an axe. Some people are like that, right? You're always going to have some exceptions. But I have found over the course of my life and my career that the generations give you at least something to read the room with. So, yeah, I find it useful. To keep the years straight, the generation that we call the baby boomers, the people who came up right after World War II, right? The troops came home and had a bunch of babies. Then we had a baby boom. That was between 1946 and 1964. So the youngest boomer is right around 60 years old now, right? There are still some 60-year-olds in the professional communities, but I can't think of very many 60-year-olds who are active duty military. And Mike, do you know any 60-year-old cops?
Yeah, but usually at that point, like they're definitely slowing down, and
yeah,
but they're out there.
Yeah, we have some in that age group in the military in our civil service, our Department of the Air Force or Department of the Army civilians, the GS general scale. Couple of those. So Gen X, Generation X, was the next one after that. They were born between 1965 and 1979. So the youngest Gen Xer now is like 45, 46. And just to keep things straight, I'm kind of right between Gen X and Millennial. Millennials were born from 1980 to 1994. So the youngest millennials right now are like 30. Now consider, like, I distinctly remember as a young person growing up hearing people complain about millennials. Like, oh, these guys, they always want a trophy. They always want a pat on the back, whether they did a good job or not. They really want to hear how they're doing, and they should just know. Like, I remember hearing people complain about that. Well, that's cool. By military standards, a 30-year-old in the enlisted force, what rank would they be? They're, mid to, in some cases, senior NCOs at that point, right? Like, and mid officers, those are captains and majors. So, consider who's running your show. It's the millennials now, right? Gen Z coming up right after them, but we're between 1995 and 2012-ish, right? These years aren't perfect. The youngest Gen Zers right now are 13. So they are entering your workforce. They're entering the worker bee levels of the law enforcement world and the military world. And then after them, Gen Alphas, born between 2013, and they're still coming off the factory assembly line in 2025, right?
Yes.
So what does that mean? Okay, so we have cohorts. We have clusters of humans who get born roughly the same time. Is it like the horoscope, Leo or Sagittarius? Oh, I'm a Gen Xer, therefore I do this. Yeah, I don't know. What I do know is we see technology differently. We see social stuff differently. We have different expectations about, like, work-life balance. That was the thing. I think millennials, I think we could take some credit for saying, no, maybe we should have some work-life balance. I think that's legit. Us millennials, we got rid of irons. Like, when was the last time you ironed clothes? That was us. That was millennials. So, there are a couple of patterns that you can see in there. But every generation,
like within the last few weeks.
Nicely done. I do not iron. So every generation bitches about the next generation. It's a time-honored tradition. We talk about the World War II generation, the greatest generation. You know what the World War I generation called those guys? Pansies. Right? So there are perhaps in there some important things to understand about the next generation and maybe help you lead them. So when I think about the next generation, when I say us, I mean, the Gen Xers and the millennials. And when I say them, I'm talking about the Gen Zs, right? So those Gen Zs, they are all the way digital natives. Like, I remember when I got the internet. Like, I remember, like, the day I got the internet, right?
Yep.
I remember the day I got a cell phone. Gen Zers, there have always been cell phones. In fact, they don't know anything else. My kids, who are Gen Alpha, they only know what a plug-in telephone is because their classroom has one. They've never actually seen it used. The teachers use their cell phones, right?
Yeah. And maybe in movies.
Yeah. So, yeah, they're digital natives. Yeah, they're like in touch with their feelings. So what, right? So it turns out U.S. Special Operations Command, SOCOM, helped fund a study on how to lead Gen Zers. Like, how do we take these new jacks who grew up after 9/11, who have no functional memory of 9/11 if they were even alive, and how do we bring them into the fold? I think that's a worthy thing. So we should probably take a look at that study and put our tax dollars to work. So that was kind of what inspired this discussion. So Mike and I are going to kind of back and forth with you about leading these youngins.
Kids these days.
Yep. So when I looked through that SOCOM report, there were two things that really stood out and that I want to highlight up front, and then we'll kind of get into it as we go. One, the Gen Zers expect access to senior leaders. They have always lived in a world where you could just tweet the president or the Secretary of Defense or the Chief of Police. You could always do that.
Or the media.
Or the media. So the concept of like following the chain of command to ask a simple question can be kind of alien to them. Right? Back in my day, if you wanted to talk to the general, you needed to talk to like 20, 30 different people to get to that general. And now you can literally just message the general on Facebook. So that's kind of a different mindset, right? Different paradigm. Number two, Gen Zers are more likely to seek mental help. They've always been taught and always been told, hey, go get help. So they do. And interestingly, and maybe a little bit scary, they're also more likely to end up actually hurting themselves. And I don't know what to make of that. And I don't know that anyone right now really knows what to make of that. But those are two key things out of that report that I think our audience needs to latch on to.
Yeah, I don't know what to take from that last point either, Jim, but I think about, in general, I came across some research recently that talked about the declining state of happiness among Americans from 2008 to 2018, I think was their data set. And people are just becoming increasingly less happy. So that mental illness and that side of it could be part of it. So those two could be correlating, trending together, right? They're getting more help, and also suicide and self-harm is increasing. I don't know. But it's an interesting point for sure. I want to zoom out and give my little editorial on why some of this stuff matters. I know Jim touched on his, but there's so much to unpack in this. And obviously we are not sociologists or anything close to it. Like the people who study this and come up with where these boundaries are for the age groups and all the traits and whatever, there's a lot of expertise, and we are not that, right, when it comes to this sort of thing.
Well, we are tacticians who have to work with other human beings a lot.
Exactly.
Right?
And and relatedly, what I know about humans is that humans rely on patterns and habits. And we're social creatures. We tend to bunch up, right? Even if it's not in a generational sense, I mean, the idea is we socialize a lot. We tend to partner up and marry. We tend to have a tribe of one form or another, whether that's a social group, friend group, or anything of that sort. And it seems to me that we also tend to occupy one or more little echo chambers in life when it comes to the several little departments of our lives, right? Like our careers, politics, faith, whatever other interests you have out there, like sports teams, music genres, hobbies, all of that stuff, we tend to kind of group, right? And
I think we can all group around the Pink Pony Club. That is the pinnacle of culture and music right now.
And I think because we really want to make sense of it all, we like to be able to put people into buckets. We want to categorize everything so that we can wrestle with how and what to do about it, right? So if you fit into a political camp or another, or you're either religious or a heathen, or you either love or hate the Dallas Cowboys or the Raiders or whatever,
America's team,
like whatever it is, we want to lump people into those buckets, right? Into those categories. And it's how we make sense of things in a lot of ways. So when it comes to the generational stuff, like Jim mentioned earlier, like we kind of do the same thing. And it's tough because it's not just whether or not you were born after like January 1st, 1982, and therefore you are X. Like that doesn't really help us, right? It doesn't teach, if I am your leader or your boss or whatever, like that doesn't teach me how to deal with you, right? It gives us maybe a foundation of understanding, but it's not always super helpful if you stop there, right? If you stop at like, oh, I know their generation, I know everything about them. Like that's not going to do you any good. So no different than your view on politics or religion or social justice things or anything else, right? We don't want to overgeneralize and assume that everyone's going to fit neatly into a bucket, right? And that's problematic and divisive in the first place. And like Jim said, generalizing the generational stuff is kind of the point, right? But when it comes to the generational stuff, I think the lesson in all of this is we have to understand that times and people and society changes. Like values shift, the pendulum swings, right? And arguably it's for good reasons. Like the work-life balance thing that Jim mentions, it's probably a good thing. Like people were working themselves into the ground, right? And social justice stuff. Like think about the civil rights movement, back in like the 60s and where we are today. It's not to say that there's not work to be done, but a lot has happened. And this was something that...
But I'll give you a quick example on this. The people who trained me grew up playing cowboys and Indians in Cops and Robbers. Yeah. And they would go out into the front yard and shoot each other with BB guns. Mm-hmm. A lot has changed. Even in Mike and I's generation, it wasn't super common to go shoot each other with BB guns. I'm sure some of our buddies did, but like not real common. My kids have never played cowboys and Indians, and they would look at you funny if you said cowboys and Indians, because that's not what we call them, quote unquote, right?
Right.
So like, things have changed, and now we're going to bring people into the military who just don't have much of a frame of reference for running around with a gun, right?
And they have a whole perspective on things like violence because we have socialized that a lot of ways. Yep. And that's a whole other can of worms, right?
Yep.
But, like I said, I mean, for as much work as there may be to do on like the social justice, civil rights side of things, I mean, think about how far it's come since the 60s, right? And again, not to say that everything is all better and great, but like one of the things that I used to point out to my rookies a lot when it comes to things like racism and all that stuff, right? Is imagine like you go into a neighborhood that we'll just say, quote unquote, wasn't like yours growing up, right? You're the cop that goes into one of these neighborhoods, inner city neighborhoods. And you've got to remember that the adolescents and the younger adults who live and grew up there were raised by parents who probably grew up in those times where things were very, very different and a lot arguably worse than they are today, right? They grew up in a different time and have a different lived experience. And we can debate all day long about how, better or worse off things are now, right? But you just need to understand and recognize that these people were parented by people who lived it, right? They lived in that civil rights movement, and that's a whole frame of reference that you can't even wrap your head around, right? And so I think it's one of those areas where you have to be able to recognize and empathize with, like, it's not about you and your experience. It's trying to understand that other perspective. And if you want to demonstrate leadership and gain influence or trust or whatever, like, you have to be able to wrap your head around that. And like, I think that's just one example of how generational stuff comes up, right? Like, think about the environment your parents and grandparents grew up in and what their lived experiences were like and how that affected the way you were raised, right? Regardless of how, and maybe you stuck with it, right? Maybe those values are still your values. You still hold your parents and grandparents, or maybe you drifted away and did your own thing. That's okay. But it is important to recognize how those forces can come into play in either direction, right? So some people really lean into the tradition and the way of their elders, and some people not so much. I think it's just important to recognize that we take some good with the bad when it comes to how times change and society changes, and it's all part of the bigger mosaic, right? Like it's all part of the big picture. So, I think that's part of why it matters is like to empathize and recognize that it's not really about just you and your experience. It's to understand that people's lived experiences are not just their own, but also the people that, the environment they grew up in, right? Values drive a lot of human choices and experiences, and understanding their values and hopefully finding some alignment is an important aspect of leadership.
I like that. And I'm reminded as you say that about culture eats procedures lunch.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And these kids these days are coming in a different culture from you. They have a different lived experience, right? Mike mentioned growing up with the civil rights movement, and that is still in living memory, but it is not in the living memory of the current cohort of the bulk of police officers, right? Or the bulk of military members. So when we look at millennials, and I'm quoting out of this report, this is just kind of in the reference stuff out of that SOCOM report, and we'll link to that report in the show notes so you can take a look at it. They started out by kind of describing like what are the general characteristics that you see among millennials, and one of the things that really hits is that age group is accustomed to news stories about Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and the war on terror, right? It's the 9/11 generation, right? And they have access to more combat footage by way of YouTube than their parents ever saw from Vietnam. Totally unfettered, totally uncensored, and immediate access to soldiers' attitudes and frustrations while deployed. So consider how that affected how we all saw Iraq, for example.
Yeah, I mentioned the socializing violence is a lot, the exposure is a lot higher, right?
Oh, yeah.
That kind of thing.
And, I graduated high school in 1999, a year after Columbine, right? And as anyone who's listened to this show knows that painted my view of the world for the rest of my life. That painted my view of the world. And then I was in college when 9/11 happened. And, graduated into the GWAT. And so now I'm at the sunset of my career, and I'm a GWAT baby. I'm every kind of, Iraq, Afghanistan. That's where I spent most of my adult life, at least on the deployed side.
For anyone not tracking, GWAT, Global War on Terror.
That's right. All over the world. Iraq, Afghanistan, and some other places too.
Asterisk.
But, I'm part of the effort now to kind of help us shift gears out of that toward integrated deterrence, great power competition, whatever you want to call it, Cold War 2.0, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran,
World War
transnational terrorist groups, whoever, Mexico, I don't know. So how do I cognitively shift gears? And then how do I shift this whole organization, this whole machine that's super good at schwacking terrorists every night, and turn it into something that can cost effectively, calmly convince China that screwing around is not a good idea? That is a mindset shift. That is a paradigm shift that I have to get my head around in order to get the whole machinery that military's head around, right? So yeah, that is the world I absolutely grew up in, and that most of my cohort grew up in. We millennials are more diverse than Gen X or the boomers were. especially in the professional world, right? The fraction of adults among millennials who are not white is higher than for prior generations, exceeding 40% of the cohort, which is substantial. Millennials are less attached to traditional institutions. As of 2014, roughly half of millennials identify themselves as political independents, and nearly a third did not identify a religious affiliation. So that might be, for example, why we've seen the political parties kind of turn on their heads in the last couple of years, because millennials don't care. So who cares what the head of the GOP says? I don't care, right? Millennials are less economically secure, right? Millennials were the first generation to experience the combination of high levels of student loans, poverty and unemployment, and low levels of wealth and personal income, right? I was in my 20s when the 2008 financial crisis hit, and the .com bubble and the housing loan mortgage thing exploded. Situation happened. So because of that being less economically secure, millennials tend to have reduced rates of marriage relative to prior generations at the same age. They were more likely to be found living at home between the ages of 25 to 35. And, that again drives a worldview. Hey, I got to look out for me because the financial market isn't gonna, okay? Also, millennials tend to be more educated. They were pushed to go to college. A lot of them went to college. 40% of millennial workers aged 25 to 29 had at least a bachelor's degree, continuing the trend of increasing education seen across generational cohorts. Cool. So those are just a couple basic traits that you'll see among millennials. Now, getting into Gen Z, kind of in contrast, number one thing, they're digital natives, right? They grew up with access to technology, smartphones, social media, instant internet access. And consider what that means. That doesn't just mean staring at their phone all the time. That means their identity online is a much bigger deal to them. Their personal brand is a much bigger deal to them. That is as much part of their identity as how they look, right?
The other thing about digital natives is just how much of their life is, I'm hypothesizing, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's the identity and the branding, the social side of it, but also they probably, their life, the operating system of their life probably exists mostly electronically. Yeah. Right, and not analog, and I don't know what the takeaway from that is, but if I just think about using pen and paper or a whiteboard versus a tablet or an app or something like that, just little things like that I feel like I've had to watch out for in a number of cases. Teaching a class, are they on their phone fucking off? Or is that where they're taking notes?
Both.
Yeah, but worth be curious, not judgmental, right?
Yeah. Oh, and the seam is gone, right?
Well, and I've taken so many notes on my phone, and I always wonder or worry, maybe is a better word, is I hope they don't think that I'm just texting right now. I'm actually trying to jot down what they just said, and it gives a little impression. And I just think that's one of those things that digital natives, they're not existing in a pen and paper operating system, right?
That's a great point. And it actually came up for me recently. So I have a dog had a series of health issues and ended up taking him to the vet. And then that wasn't working out. So I took him to an emergency vet, and that wasn't working out. So I took him to the State College Veterinary Hospital. And so there was some rock star vet and then usually a couple of students. And the students would sit down and take my history and, when did this start happening with the dog? And, then you did what? And then you saw what symptom, taking a history. and they were trying to tap it into a tablet. And every time I was explaining it over and over and over with each one of these, and I found I actually had to write it up on a whiteboard. And once I did, they understood what was going on. And until I wrote it up on a whiteboard, they did not understand what was going on. But it didn't occur to them, despite the fact they were standing next to a whiteboard, to try to use it.
Yeah.
Trying to get it all.
Well, like I've got a whiteboard on my wall, and I have to sometimes remind myself that, some of my like goals, even if it's just like big picture goals or just weekly goals, like putting it somewhere on a whiteboard in the corner of my office where I'm going to see it and notice it every day versus somewhere in my phone I might not. It's easy to look past, right? Like there's some advantage to that, I think, in some cases. But regardless, the whole point of it is to recognize like the operating system of their brain is functionally different. And
if you're trying to get a shared understanding, you got to have some medium that goes across between your operating system and theirs.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Good stuff.
Yeah. So next point, the Gen Zers are the first post 9/11 generation. For Gen Z members, the attacks on 9/11 occurred either when they were too young to remember or before they were born. Right. That's always been a thing. It's always been a thing in the background. It's always been more or less under control. Right. I remember right after 9/11, it did not feel even a little bit under control. And that drove like, why is there a Department of Homeland Security? Why is there a TSA? Why do I have to take my shoes off at the airport? Why is there pre-check? All of that was because it felt very, very not under control on September 12th, 2001, right?
It's kind of this is an aside, I'll say. We had a guy on the show, James Galliano. He was an FBI HRT guy. He was a law enforcement analyst for like CNN and a few others. And I think he's like a mayor of a small city somewhere on the East Coast now. I don't know if that's still what he's up to, but he gave a talk one time, and he talked about kind of like the unity and stuff of the country after 9/11. And one of the things he specifically brought up in his talk was like, remember how it felt on that morning of September 12th. Everyone was like, very much united we stand, right? Like, and I think that bred and there's a whole bunch to unpack as it relates to the wars that obviously followed, right? But when it comes to things like patriotism and service orientation, like those of us that were coming of age on September 12th remember that feeling, right? It was a very vibrant feeling, I think. And it's hard for people that didn't grow up that experiencing that to necessarily understand the patriotism, the service orientation, maybe that we were that we had the opportunity to see. So
I like that.
Side note.
Kind of relatedly, the impact of COVID on the generations, and this is not in the report, but
it's a good one.
As it relates to things like coping, I have noticed, and I don't have great data to support this, but anecdotally, there has been an unusual spike in threats made by kids who are 13 years old in this academic year. When I, follow different law enforcement agency Facebook pages and they say, hey, we arrested this kid for making threats. He's 13. I've seen that now dozens of times this year. There's something about the kids who are 13 years old here in 2025 as we record this. And I think it has to do with how old they were when COVID hit.
And what they did with all that free time. Yeah.
Yeah. But, or lack of socialization, lack of integration with kids and teachers when they were kindergarten age, that kind of thing. But I think it is hitting them hard. And we have to ask, how did that affect each of those generations? How did that affect us millennials? I know it aged me probably a good 5 years.
For sure.
So getting back into it, Gen Zers are pragmatic and financially conservative. They grew up watching their parents deal with the consequences of the recession of 2008 and having experienced rates of poverty that reached nearly 1 in 4 children. So they tend to have a desire for more stability and a stable job, right? Less gambling with their investments and more like get the bills paid. Doesn't mean they're all going to be like that, but that tends to be the trend. Gen Zers tend to be more accepting and empathetic. Many members of Gen Z grew up after such developments as like Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and legalization of marriage between same-sex couples, right? Like that has always been reality for them. I distinctly remember in my time in the Air Force, the first time someone came out to me as gay. And it was risky for them to do that, right? Because at the time, that was like illegal in the military. So Gen Zers are coming up with a different attitude, right? So to quote the report, this combined with Gen Z being the most diverse generation yet leads members of Gen Z to think that being socially liberal goes without saying, and they're often horrified that anyone would think otherwise. Right, so that's not so much a political stance. That's just like that's the world they grew up in. Right, they come across more lefty, whether they intend to or not, or whether they would even see it or not. They, Gen Zers, have mental health challenges. I mentioned this up front because I think this is one of the big things we need to hit. Gen Z has sometimes been referred to as the loneliest generation because of the vast amount of time they spend on screens and with digital relationships as opposed to personal ones. Gen Zers also look at the state of the US today and see increasing trends toward divisiveness and discord, which increases their levels of experienced stress. Man, is the world getting worse? I don't know. I think World War I was worse than whatever we have now. Right? World War II was worse than whatever we have now. So a lot of that to me is outlook. They were raised with a more pessimistic outlook, right? By their parents and their parents' parents. For example, according to a poll by the American Psychological Association, 75% of Gen Z respondents said that mass shootings were a significant source of stress. Man. The same poll found that just over a quarter, 27% of Gen Zers reported that their mental health as fair or poor, roughly double the rate of millennial or Gen X respondents. That is a challenge. Okay? That's a challenge for hiring cops.
For sure.
That's a challenge for hiring military people. Major depression is usually not a thing we're really like seeking in our midst, right? Gen Zers are more health conscious. One positive aspect of Gen Zers is they're more willing to acknowledge mental health issues and seek treatment. They're also more physically health conscious. They smoke and drink less than prior generations. They tend to be healthier eaters. That's a win. They're more likely to take like a whole of life attitude. And their career choices are kind of just one part of that. Gen Zers tend to be shrewd consumers. They're pragmatic and digitally savvy. They're harder to trick with ads. We'll see about that. But they are.
Ads are just still learning.
Right? Yeah. They know how to kind of sort their way through the advertising environment, right? Because they're native to it. Gen Zers value privacy and personalization. In what might seem like a contradiction, members of Gen Z value personal privacy and gravitate towards social media applications that provide tools that let them tailor their digital interactions. They want to control who sees what. Okay? Gen Zers have also grown up knowing that social media and other companies are tracking every move. They understand that in a way that millennials even struggle with it. And they just kind of accept that as the price of personalized service. I was talking to my niece a couple months ago, and I was talking about TikTok, and I'm like, oh, watch out, TikTok's the devil, it's run by China. And she's like, I know. I'm like, so so you don't have it on your phone, do you? And she's like, oh yeah, I definitely have it on my phone. Right? She accepts that and doesn't care. So from that report, the suggestions the report makes as far as leading that cohort, leading the Gen Zers, one is lead with meaning. Focus on the personal significance of any message to the Gen Z audience and ensure it's communicated through all available channels. Say it, text it, tweet it, Facebook it, TikTok it, get your message out, but lead with meaning.
I like this point, and my take on this that I've noticed about leading a younger crowd, and as well as how I respond to being led or influenced. I include myself in that observation, but the lead with meaning thing, I think one of the things I've observed is like, because I said so just doesn't work anymore. And it certainly doesn't, it's never worked well for me. I've always been the type of person that would push back on that, right? And it's because I would go out and I'd do the research and I would find more information, and I would try to challenge, bad messaging, right? If it wasn't being clearly fed to me, like, because I said so, that's not a good enough explanation, I think, for us younger folk, and younger even than I am, obviously.
I'd say that's one of the things the millennials won. Why matters. We need the why.
Exactly. Right. And for a lot of reasons, actually, like the insight behind a lot of the decision making is useful in terms of, like, if you think about the tenets of like decentralized command and shaping the decision making of future leaders, right? Like helping make sure they understand why you're making certain decisions so that when they have to make decisions, they see that picture, right? But these days, there's just too much information out there and examples to pull from. And if you're making difficult decisions, you should expect to explain yourself. And that doesn't mean that you have to be soft. You could be firm about your decisions. It just means that using some of that communication skills, that's also going to help you be more liked and probably more effective. So I think that's a really good point.
I like that. Next is walk the walk. Demonstrate expertise in messaging, live preached values, and act publicly on feedback from Gen Z audiences. They expect access. Cool. When they get that access, respond.
Yeah. Yeah. This is, I think this also speaks to the point earlier about the mental health stuff when it comes to, the narrative that kids these days are just weak or they're soft or whatever, and that the older generation's more mentally tough or resilient. Maybe if you're part of that older generation and you've got some pride in your resilience and your mental toughness, like, use the good parts of your experience to your advantage, right? Those generational traits are positive. Mental toughness and resilience are good things. So maybe use that as like leverage to coach and mentor them. Like, recognize how you and them are different and have empathy with that. But I think in terms of that expertise, it goes a long way in how you can coach and mentor people as well.
Next is provide the right source. Leverage Gen Z members to speak to the ranks by bringing in the sergeant rather than the sergeant major. And the way I interpret that is positional authority just doesn't have nearly as much weight with them. They're less impressed by the general, right? And again, that they've always had access to general. They've always been able to read what the general says. So find the right person, the person who actually has the message, the person who actually has the expertise, and have that person do the talking. Next, connect both online and off. Encourage, and if you need to, force Gen Z members to build personal and not just digital connections with their peers and leaders. Restricting the use of devices in certain circumstances might be required. I want you to be thoughtful about how you do that. Because doing it just to be a dick
arbitrarily,
they will catch on and they will punish you for it.
And that goes back to the because I said so thing, right? Like,
yeah. But I think you're within your rights at the end of the day to say, hey, let's put our phones in the bin for an hour and do a traditional old school analog team building exercise. Let's do trust falls, right?
For sure.
Next, meet them where they are. Be on the lookout for signs of mental distress or mental health issues. Make Gen Z members aware of mental health and resiliency resources available to them. Again, this is a thing I legit worry about with them.
Yeah, and that's fair. I think that was a very interesting point in the whole thing. Not from the report, obviously, but just an observation that we've touched on in here a couple times when it comes to work-life balance. And I mentioned this earlier, but be mindful of people's time. And we talked about how values shift, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, younger crowd just wants to work their 40 hours and call it a week, and they don't want to get called in on overtime all the time and work themselves into the ground. And I think a lot of people struggle, especially in cultures or workplaces where, like, you have to earn your keep and you have to, like, the whole earning your stripes thing. Like, honestly, to set up those personal boundaries to say, like, no, I'm going to work my 40 hours. I'm going to give you what I agreed to, and like have work-life balance. Like, I think that's actually pretty respectable. Right. And I see it get shunned sometimes. Like, if you're not working all this extra overtime, apparently you're no good, right? Like, you're not a hard enough worker. And I think this just goes back to the people, ideas, and hardware thing, right? Value and respect your people and their time and the things that they care about. And just because you had to run yourself into the ground to get where you got doesn't mean that that was probably how it should have been, right? I think being respectful of people's time is a big deal. And it goes to kind of putting your money where your mouth is when it comes to valuing people as a resource, as your first and best resource, right? Recognizing our differences is okay, right? But these are the cards you're going to get dealt, right? In law enforcement, 2025, right? Recruiting and retention is difficult. So you need to find some alignment with the values and make the best of it, right? And I'm not saying you should make compromises per se. I'm saying that, you know, you need to make sure that you recognize that those people are the most important part of your organization.
Yeah, I've got a bunch of things on that. One is, too many instructors see themselves as evaluators first and then instructors.
Yeah.
And I hate that.
Yes.
Right?
Your job is to teach them.
If these new recruits don't meet the standard, guess what? You got to get them to that standard. Like, end of discussion on that. Like, you have to get them to the standard. The next tranche of recruits probably ain't going to be any better. You get what you get, and you got to get them up and over the hump, right? And don't get mad at people for being products of their environment. One, it just doesn't do any good, right? So if these kids these days are soft, well, the environment they grew up in was soft. Guess what? I need you to figure out how to harden them up.
Coach and mentor them with your experience in mental toughness and resilience and grit.
Yeah. And the challenge for you is figuring out how to do that, right? How to do that in a way that you're not just crushing them, but
or creating a toxic environment or culture.
Yeah. But build them into that and being physically resilient, mentally resilient. And there are ways you can teach resilience. There are ways you can teach people how to overcome stress. Maybe we should work on that. My generation, it's funny, a lot of the dudes that I talk to in my generation, when they talk about what's going on in their lives, they use the word anxiety a lot. A lot. And that is what my generation was taught. We were taught to be anxious about every goddamn thing. We were taught to be anxious about terrorists. We were taught to be anxious about COVID. We were taught to be anxious about the housing market. We were taught to be anxious about school shooters. And man, we internalize that. Maybe it's time for us millennials to figure out how to overcome that a little bit. People volunteer for service because they want to do the things. They want to do the things. They want to do cool stuff. You sign up for for the police academy because you wanted to go do cool cop things. You sign up for ranger training because you want to do cool ranger things, right? But they need you to teach them, and they likely haven't seen a lot of that, whatever skills, growing up, right? The problem is, in this corporate culture, we are under a ton of pressure to cut days of training. How many days is the police academy in Southern Arizona these days?
Jeez. It keeps
5, 10.
Keeps getting longer. I don't know.
Okay.
I think we're pushing like 30 weeks or something.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
It's impressive.
Yeah.
Well, consider you may need to add days of training. If your recruits have never touched a gun before, or even played, like I said, cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians, like you might need to do more of that. I watched a video about fire department training a couple days ago, and the guy was saying, I grew up with every kind of 2-stroke engine. I grew up with, 4-wheeling and chainsaws and stuff like that. And we take these fire department recruits, we put them up on a rooftop. It's the first time they've ever touched a chainsaw. And then we yell at them when they screw it up. It's like, well, maybe you need a chainsaw day, right? Like whatever skills you need them to have, don't assume that they've got them, and don't be mad at them for not having them. You just fix it. I think that's all I got.
I think the ownership is the big part of it, right? The thing, if there's anything to know about the generational stuff and leading people of a different generation, and that includes leading up, frankly. There's a lot, like a lot of older generation people that I've had to try to lead up to in some way or another. And that also applies, but it's taking ownership, right? Leadership is about that influence, and you have to, the generational differences, or the just differences period among people, like they just are. It's your job to navigate and take ownership of your messaging and be effective. Whatever that looks like, right? It's about being effective. And you just have to be able to see, like, this is as much a read the room thing as anything, right? Approaches will differ. And that's just life. That's all I got, Jim.
That's all I got. Be safe out there. Be smart out there. We're cheering you on.
All right, guys, that's all we got for tonight. This episode is brought to you by 09 Holsters. We talk a lot about people, ideas, and hardware on this show, so when we invest in equipment, we always think in terms of experience first. 09 is helping you figure out how to carry the gear you need to be effective. They are built by cops, for cops, with a minimalist design and bomb-proof durability. Radio cases, flashlights, body cameras, even canine remotes, you name it, 09 has been filling a void in tactical duty holsters for more than a decade. Go see what they offer at 09 Holsters, that's ZERO, the number 9, holsters.com. 09, built to win the fight.
And this is Jim. This episode is also brought to you by ManusX. We've talked a lot about the tactical fantasy on this podcast, and one of the quickest ways to break your tactical fantasies and actually improve your performance is by getting real feedback. One of the ways you can do that is with ManusX. You're not going to get better at shooting on your own. You need practice, data, and coaching. And you need to make the most of your ammo with good live and dry fire training. Manus is a family of training devices that tracks you while you train. It times and tracks everything you do in a drill and coaches you as you go. It is indispensable to taking your shooting to the next level. Go find them on manusx.com.
Don't forget that we put out new episodes on the 1st and the 15th of every month. If you like what we're doing, you can head over to Patreon, give us $1 for each new episode. That money's going to go back into bringing you good content. If you want to interact with us, you could find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We are at TacTangents. You can also email info@tacticaltangents.com. All right. That's all we got. Good talk.